Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. By way of introduction of our subject tonight, we'll start with this. Well, that, of course, is Prince Rogers Nelson, aka Prince, aka the artist formerly known as Prince, and then known as Prince again, who died recently at the age of 57. So I guess he's the artist formerly known as Prince again. That song Purple Rain by Prince and his backup group The Revolution is the title track from his 1984 album of the same name, and it was also the soundtrack album for the 1984 film of the same name, and it was a combination of rock, pop, gospel, and orchestral music. Went to number 2 in the United States when it was released, and actually went to number 1 in both the United States and England after his death recently. Rolling Stone ranked it number 143 on their list of 500 greatest songs of all time. I've never thought too much of the Rolling Stone list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, but it was a good song. And although the movie wasn't very good, Prince did win the Academy Award for the Best Original Song Score in 1985 for Purple Rain. Prince was a Minnesota boy born in Minneapolis. I got into a discussion the other day in Starbucks as to who is the greatest musical icon ever from Minnesota. The votes were between Bob Dylan and Prince. I don't know, I sort of leaned towards Judy Garland myself, but I was in the minority there. But anyway, Prince was certainly a great songwriter, a great performer, and a great musician. He was a tremendous guitarist, definitely underrated in that respect. So I guess if you had to look at all three things, Dylan may have been the greater songwriter, but in terms of musicianship and performance, you'd have to go with Prince. In fact, if you looked at record sales and attendance at concerts, as a solo performer, if it wasn't Michael Jackson, then it was Prince who was the most popular artist of the 1980s. And while his popularity waxed and waned during the 1990s and 2000s, he was still among the top performers in the world. I always want to bring you something that doesn't get mentioned in the other obits, so here goes. Now I have to tell you, Prince was a little guy, and he was sort of a weird dude. A lot of idiosyncrasies to Prince. But women loved him. Some really beautiful women, in fact. You know how you hear guys always went into rock bands because they get women? Well, Prince was probably the best example of that there was. If Prince wasn't a musician, I don't know that there'd be too many women falling all over him. Here's one of his collaborators, Sheila E., talking about when she met Prince.
I met Prince in 1978, I think it was. He played here in the Bay Area. And after he performed, I was walking backstage to introduce myself, and he was in the mirror, and he shook my hand. He goes, "I know who you are." And I went, "Huh?" He says, I've been following your career. That's when we started, just hanging out, working together, and listening to music. But then 83, he just said, "Don't you want to do a record?" So it seemed like it was weeks later, I was in the studio recording my record. And I went on a Purple Rain tour with him. And at the time, we became, I guess, girlfriend and boyfriend, as they would say.
Here's Apollonia, another good-looking woman who was his co-star in Purple Rain.
I get back home from the audition, and they said, "You have a callback, but they're going to fly you to Minnesota to meet Prince." He picks me up, and we go for a long drive in his purple limo. We had a date that evening. So we just danced up a storm, had a great time, and then, dropped me off at my hotel room. His bodyguard said, "The kid really likes you." And I said, "Cool. I like him too." Were we romantically involved? Well, back then I used to always say, "I don't kiss and tell." We were, and still are, platonically, romantically involved. There's a lot of romance. I was not his girlfriend. He was not my boyfriend, but he's my greatest friend.
All right, for a more conventional view on Prince, let's go to the BBC4 Last Word with Matthew Bannister and Paul Gambaccini, an expat American from the Bronx who's the BBC rock expert.
Prince Rogers Nelson from Minneapolis, Minnesota became Prince rock superstar.
Don't have to be
Prince sold 100 million albums. He was musically versatile in the studio and a dramatic showman on stage. He always enjoyed playing intimate gigs as well as stadia. At the height of his fame in 1993, he played for an invited audience of a couple of hundred people, including me, in the BBC Radio Theatre in the heart of Broadcasting House, a gig that was broadcast on Radio 1's Simon Bates show.
Don't worry, I won't hurt you.
The producer was Fergus Dudley.
Well, we got a phone call just saying that Prince was in London and wanted to do a gig for the BBC. This was on a Friday night, and the gig turned out to be the following Monday morning.
In the BBC Radio Theatre, not a large venue.
No, it was a very small and intimate gig, and we know from recent gigs that Prince did when he turned up in London. He likes doing that kind of stuff, but this may have set the model for that.
Did you get to talk to him when he came to play the Radio Theatre?
Not directly. We were sort of under instruction that anything that we needed to do with him would have to go through his minders. And there was quite an amusing moment where just before he was about to go on stage and we needed to make sure he was ready, I actually had to look at his minder, ask his minder if he was ready. His minder asked Prince, and Prince said yes. Bear in mind, I'm standing right next to this man at the time.
Are you ready?
It was an interesting and loud gig. We had complaints from Radio 3 at the time because the levels were so high. It was interrupting Radio 3's broadcast, and apparently the last time that happened was when Jimi Hendrix played there.
Can you remember what he played?
He definitely played 1999.
You woke up this morning, what a day. The sky was all purple, there were people running everywhere. Time to put some money, something, you know I didn't even care.
The atmosphere was electric. To be in front of such an amazing artist. And I've seen him at several concerts, and then seen him play as long at the after show as he played actually at the concert, which people were paying for. And to have him in such a room, it was an electric gig.
That's Prince playing live here at Broadcasting House in London in 1993. I'm joined by the music broadcaster and writer Paul Gambaccini. I think, Paul, you saw him some years earlier when he played his first ever British gig.
1981 at the Lyceum, when the Lyceum was still a dance hall. Now, of course, Lion King is playing there. And I went with Bob Geldof and Paula Yates and their friend Chris Hill. And Prince was promoting his new album, Controversy. And the place was only half full because he hadn't had a hit in Britain yet.
It's interesting, the style of his music, because it seems to bring together rock music and soul and funk and meld them into one thing.
Well, you've hit it spot on, because Prince himself said most people that are his friends are interested in one kind of music, but that's not enough for him. So he liked James Brown and George Clinton, but he also loved Fleetwood Mac. So he was after the tunefulness as well as the funk and the instrumentation and melody.
And in the studio, he often played many of the instruments himself, didn't he?
Oh, yes. His very first album, For You, he is just him. He's playing everything. And this, of course, is almost in the vein of Paul McCartney, who's famous for telling his drummers how to play the drums. Prince really did operate a band like James Brown. He picked them. He basically looked over their shoulder, made sure they were doing what he wanted them to do.
And he had all these female muses, didn't he? Sometimes they were his lovers, sometimes not. But he used to pick out female singers and female musicians and work closely with them.
Yes, one of them, Vanity, has recently passed away, which caused him sadness. This was part of the visual presentation of Prince, because Prince himself was a short person, quite amusing for someone who loves basketball, as he did, and he played it in school. But he would surround himself either with these huge male bouncers or these very attractive females. And when he won the Oscar for Best Original Song Score for Purple Rain, he was accompanied to the podium by Wendy and Lisa of The Revolution, Prince and the Revolution. So there they are on either side of him, and he's in the middle, shorter, and making his speech in a very small voice because he was a shy speaker.
Was that the reason why he rarely gave interviews, do you think?
I think that's definitely one reason. I think he also didn't want to be grilled on his private life. But he also, frankly, doesn't seem to have been a great interviewee, because in the last years of his life, he did give some interviews, which are available on YouTube, and you actually think, you know what? Stick to the music. I mean, with all due respect.
Let's talk a little bit about the eccentricities, because there was a time in the 90s when he wrote "Slave" on his cheek, and he gave up his name and wanted to be known as a symbol. It was all about a dispute with his record company, wasn't it?
Well, yes, because Prince was the most productive artist of the 80s. The artists of the 60s had one or two albums a year, but record companies had discouraged artists from having that much output. And Prince just wanted to keep putting out records, and he had 39 studio albums in all. And he was having hit after hit after hit after hit. There was almost no time when there wasn't a Prince song on the radio. And Warner Brothers wanted him to put out fewer records. Can you imagine that? I mean, even in the last 2 years of his life, he put out 4 albums. So he wanted to get out of that contract, and he wanted ownership of his masters. And so this is why the whole public thing, and George Michael, of course, and he inspired each other on that one. And Slave, yes, written on, and then he gave up the name Prince because he said that was associated with works that are owned by Warner Brothers, so he has to be the artist formerly known as Prince.
Well, he came back to the name Prince in the end. Prince, who's died aged 57. Thank you very much to Paul Gambaccini for joining us.
Okay, I want to take care of a little more personal Prince business here. You heard him playing 1999 in that segment. I want to play you my other favorite Prince song, Raspberry Beret.
That's when I saw her. Woo, I saw her. She walked in through the outdoor. She wore a raspberry beret, the kind you find in a second-hand store. Raspberry beret, and if it was wrong, she wouldn't wear much more. Raspberry beret, I think I love her.
Well, I mentioned Prince was an excellent songwriter. Here are 2 really big songs he wrote for other people. First is for the Bangles.
These are the days when you wish your bed was already made. It's just another manic Monday. Wish it was Sunday. That's my fun day. I don't have to run day. It's just another manic Monday.
Here's one I didn't realize Prince wrote. Good song, big hit for Sinead O'Connor in 1990.
I could eat my dinner in a fancy restaurant, but nothing, I said nothing can take away these blues, 'cause nothing compares to you.
And I mentioned that Prince was an underrated guitarist. Well, at the 2004 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction for him, he did some pretty heavy guitar work with Steve Winwood, Jeff Lynne, and Tom Petty on George Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Just between you and me, I don't think Bob Dylan could do that. Well, I want to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And although our show is about Prince tonight, I want to make a brief mention of another pretty good guitar picker, Lonnie Mack, who died recently at the age of 74. Disciple of Chet Atkins, Les Paul, and Merle Travis, he was an occasional session man for James Brown or Freddie King, but he had a big hit himself with his instrumental cover of Chuck Berry's Memphis that went to number 5 in 1963.